Good evening to those of you who have taken refuge in the marbled halls of the National Liberal Club, which on a day like today is pleasantly cool, as opposed to absolutely freezing as it is during the winter time. But today that's a good thing. And to the people who are with us online, welcome to you too. What we're going to do is we're going to try and inject a bit of spontaneity into some of this. It can be a bit dull sometimes online. We want to include those of you who are online as much as possible. So we would encourage you to post your questions, I think, in the chat function. And Duncan, my lovely assistant, will help with reading them out. And we'll intersperse between questions from the floor in here and questions on there. Welcome to the Liberal Democrat History Group summer meeting discussing the fall of the Lloyd George coalition. This could not have been better timed, I think, than anything. Because 2022 marks the centenary of the departure of Lloyd George, the last Liberal to hold the post of Prime Minister. He had resigned after 6 years as Premier, and his fall followed the decision of Conservative MPs meeting in the Carlton Club earlier that day to end the post-war coalition. Now, I'm not saying there are any similarities or anything, or parallels, but word did have it that Theresa May was seen leading a conga the other week, last week, necking champagne and singing "Happy Days Are Here Again." So the end of a dramatic premiership is what we're here to talk about, and we are enormously lucky. We have got with us Dr. Matthew Johnson from the Department of Modern History at Durham. He specialises in, I love it, the impact of war on politics and society, and in militarism as a political and ideological phenomenon in Britain during the 20th century. I think that's what a fascinating subject to look at. And he has his work has explored issues around civil and military relations and the politics of national defence in England or in the United Kingdom?
In the United Kingdom.
In the United Kingdom, so even more interesting. So first we're going to talk about the wartime Liberal crisis and where that left Lloyd George, and then the second half of your talk is about his Lloyd George's attempt to reshape the party system after the collapse in 1918. So we are delighted to welcome you. Go for it.
Thanks very much. And yeah, thanks for having me here, and thanks for coming to listen. As you say, this talk's a bit more topical than I think we'd expected it was going to be when we set it up a few weeks ago. You've got a Prime Minister who wins, well, in Lloyd George's case, a landslide, certainly a substantial majority, apparently unassailable, and then out of office a few years later as a result of Conservative backbench, well, in Johnson's case, backbench in cabinet. In Lloyd George's case, it was really backbench conspiring. As you mentioned, Lloyd George had been in power for 6 years. He'd come to office by effectively forcing the resignation of his predecessor, Herbert Asquith, who was a fellow Liberal and previously a close colleague. Lloyd George steered the country to victory in the Great War after the armistice, called a snap general election, and won this landslide victory. But the problem was, although, as you said, Lloyd George was Britain's last Liberal Prime Minister, he only ever ruled at the head of a coalition administration. And his time in office was entirely dependent on the support of Conservative backbench opinion. And as you say, in October 1922, Conservative MPs met at the Carlton Club, and that support was withdrawn. So in this talk, I'd like to use my time to say really to do two things: to talk a little bit about the broader context, and in particular the Liberal context behind the fall of Lloyd George, about why it was that his fate was decided not by the electorate or by his own party, but by Tories. And then to talk a little bit about what actually happened in 1922 and about why Lloyd George's attempts to reshape the party system in Britain after the war ultimately proved so short-lived and unsuccessful. So, as we've already established, Lloyd George was the last Liberal politician to hold the office of Prime Minister in Britain. And his fall in 1922 was therefore not simply a personal defeat. I think we need to see it as the conclusion or the sort of symbolic culmination of a period of acute liberal crisis in Britain. The Liberal Party had split during the Great War into rival factions loyal either to Lloyd George or to his predecessor Asquith. And this division had hardened. They started off as kind of ill-defined factions. They eventually established parties, the Liberals under Asquith, the coalition Liberals under Lloyd George, and they fought the 1918 and 1922 elections in opposition to one another. More profoundly, historians often talk about the Great War in terms of a crisis not just of the Liberal Party, but of liberalism itself. So the demands of waging total war, or a kind of total war after August 1914, the growth of state control, the curtailment of individual liberty, censorship of the press, and I think above all, the introduction of military conscription. These things have been seen as posing an existential challenge to liberal values. And according to the great historian A.J.P. Taylor, by 1916, halfway through the war, liberals were faced with a choice. They could abandon their liberalism or abandon the war. Lloyd George, according to his critics, chose the former option. Despite his past as a radical opponent of British imperialism, he'd been a strong critic of the Anglo-Boer War at the turn of the century. He emerged during the Great War, alongside his colleague Winston Churchill, as a strong advocate of military conscription and more energetic industrial mobilization. And so, as I say, in December 1916, he joined with the Conservatives to overthrow Asquith and form a new coalition committed to a more vigorous prosecution of the war. As I said a moment ago, he does this successfully. The armistice is agreed. He goes to the country, secures a landslide majority, and then finds the support withdrawn just 4 years later. And I suppose if we think about this wider context, the reputation that Lloyd George acquires during the Great War, that of a cynical politician who abandons his liberalism in pursuit of first military victory and then political power, followed him to the end of his life. So you got the damning verdict of the economist John Maynard Keynes, who described Lloyd George as merely a political adventurer rooted in nothing. And I think in this telling of the story, Lloyd George's fate was perhaps both inevitable and deserved. But I don't think this does tell the full story. I think to understand the fall of Lloyd George, and in particular to understand it in the context of the disintegration of Liberals as a viable party of government, we need to think again about the impact of the war on the Liberal Party and on liberalism. So it's worth remembering right from the start that most Edwardian Liberals were not pacifists. It's true that when Europe was plunged into diplomatic and military crisis in the summer of 1914, a majority in the Liberal cabinet and the wider Liberal Party and the Liberal press hoped that Britain might preserve its neutrality, notwithstanding the rather ill-defined or ill-understood British obligations to its Entente partners, France and Russia. As late as the 24th of July, Asquith wrote to Venetia Stanley that Europe appeared to be on the brink of war, but, and this is a quote, happily, there seems to be no reason why we should be anything more than spectators. Obviously, that didn't work out. The situation was transformed by the German invasion of Belgium, and just 11 days later, Asquith successfully rallied his party behind a declaration of war, with only 2 relatively minor cabinet resignations. So the Liberals might not have sought war, but nor did they shrink from it. And indeed, 66 sitting Liberal members of Parliament served in the armed forces during the Great War. And I'm currently working on an article about ex-servicemen who were elected to Parliament as Liberal MPs in the 1920s. And there are more than 100 that are elected in the decade after the war, having worn uniform. If anyone's interested, I'm happy to sort of take more questions on that at the end, but I'll simply mention it now just as a further piece of evidence that we shouldn't assume liberalism means pacifism. It's true that the unprecedented demands of total war present particular problems for Liberals. But again, I think the reality of this challenge for the Liberal government has often been misunderstood. A.J.P. Taylor, if I can quote him again, argued that Liberals struggled to respond effectively to the crisis of the Great War because of their commitment to free enterprise and laissez-faire principles. But the Liberal Party of the early 20th century had never been a laissez-faire party, certainly not committed to laissez-faire policies. This was the government that had passed the People's Budget, that had introduced old age pensions, national insurance against sickness and unemployment, and on the eve of war, had been embarking on Lloyd George's Great Land Campaign, which was aimed at providing better and more affordable housing and at beginning to address the the problem of low wages. So it's an interventionist government, socially, economically, fiscally, and constitutionally. It's true that Lloyd George outstripped most of his Liberal colleagues in his enthusiasm for wartime measures like military conscription. But the idea that he was abandoning Liberal principles that his colleagues were trying desperately to uphold doesn't quite work. Most of the major Liberal ideological compromises of the Great War were ushered in not under Lloyd George, but under Asquith. It was Asquith who oversaw the introduction of the Defence of the Realm Act in 1914, which, among other things, laid the groundwork for the system of wartime press censorship. It was Asquith who, to the dismay of his cabinet colleagues, dissolved the last Liberal government in May 1915 and invited the Conservatives and the Labour Party into coalition. And it was this coalition ministry under Asquith that in January 1916 introduced a military service bill that would implement a system of conscription. And this was a bill that passed the House of Commons with the support of a majority of Liberal MPs. Undoubtedly, many Liberals supported these measures only reluctantly, but Lloyd George always denied that his more determined support for military conscription and industrial mobilisation meant that he had abandoned his progressive principles. On the contrary, he was careful to point out that Liberals had always accepted limits on individual liberty and had supported state compulsion in areas like taxation and education. Obviously, compulsory military service is not the same as compulsory education, and military conscription rather smacked of Prussianism, which Britain was ostensibly fighting to defeat during the war. But even military conscription, Lloyd George argued, could be defended as the most democratic and egalitarian means of raising a national army. Unlike Britain's traditional system of voluntary recruiting, which had tended to recruit overwhelmingly from the ranks of the kind of unskilled, unemployed working class, and was quite a regressive system in that respect, compulsory universal service could be defended on the grounds that it enshrined the principles of equality of sacrifice and common citizenship. And it was also, so Lloyd George argued, a system that had been embraced throughout history as a weapon in defense of democracy, from ancient Greece through the levée en masse of the French Revolution to Abraham Lincoln's efforts to save the Union during the American Civil War. And even after his split with Asquith in December 1916, Lloyd George did retain the support of a sizable element in the Liberal Party, in particular the backbench MPs in the pro-conscription Liberal War Committee, and of Liberal intellectuals and journalists like the historian H.A.L. Fisher and intermittently C.P. Scott, the editor of the Manchester Guardian. So rather than seeing liberalism as incompatible with the demands of total war, in a very straightforward way, I think what this shows is Liberals being pulled in different directions by the challenges of the Great War. And they are divided over how best to balance individual liberty with collective endeavour. And I think perhaps ultimately they're coming to disagree about what really constituted core Liberal values. So with that context established, I'd like to turn back to the question of coalition government and what happens in 1922. As I mentioned a moment ago, the first wartime coalition administration was formed not by Lloyd George, but by Asquith. However, this administration proved highly unstable. In part, that's down to questions of leadership style and personality. Asquith cultivated an aura of calm unflappability, which had served him very well in peacetime, and he had been a tremendously effective peacetime prime minister. But it did look dangerously like complacency during the crisis of the Great War. His wait and see approach seemed alarmingly lethargic, both to Lloyd George and to many in the Conservative Party. But I think there were also deeper structural problems in the Asquith coalition government. Asquith decided to form a coalition in May 1915 in the immediate aftermath of two scandals or crises. The first was the Shells crisis, in which Sir John French, the commander-in-chief of the British Expeditionary Force, had leaked to the press that military operations were being hindered by a lack of high explosive shells. And he was probably trying to get rid of Kitchener, the war secretary, by doing this, but it was a huge embarrassment to the government. Asquith had just given a speech in Newcastle saying there was no problem with munitions production, so the timing was quite embarrassing. The second crisis was the resignation of Jackie Fisher, the first Sea Lord, who was upset about setbacks in the Dardanelles campaign, so what was happening at Gallipoli. And these were both significant problems for the government. But my sense is Asquith's decision to take this moment to invite the Conservatives and Labour into government was in some senses more narrowly party political. In what was still, last election had been in December 1910, a hung parliament, so no overall Liberal majority. Liberals before the war had retained office with the support of the Labour Party and the Irish nationalists. So still a hung parliament. Asquith, I think, was hoping to silence Conservative criticism of his government by binding them with shared responsibility for the war effort. But he had little respect for the Unionist leadership. He once compared Bonalaw, the Conservative leader, sorry, he once compared debating Bonalaw, the Conservative leader, to wrestling with a chimney sweep. He had even less interest in sharing real power with them. So accordingly, the administration he formed kept almost all the key offices in Liberal hands. Obviously, he retained the premiership. He also insisted that the Treasury be kept by a free trader, by a Liberal, the Home Office and the Foreign Office, and the new Ministry of Munitions, which was set up to solve the Shells crisis. These all went to Liberals, or were retained by Liberals. Kitchener, the Field Marshal who'd been brought into the government at the outbreak of war, was a sort of non-party figure, and he kept his job as War Secretary, but with his powers curtailed, and as I say, in particular, with responsibility for munitions hived off into a separate department to be led by Lloyd George. Bonalaw, as Conservative leader, might have felt himself entitled to press for the Exchequer, but was given the Colonial Office, and it's sort of hard to see that as anything other than a snub, I think. So this settlement was unlikely to buy the loyalty of the Conservative Party. There was little sense of shared strategic or political vision within the cabinet. I think the administration was essentially an artificial and unbalanced stitching together of rival parties. And it never became a national government in any meaningful sense, certainly not in the way that the coalition between Churchill and the Labour Party did in the Second World War, despite the fact that they obviously had very little in common in all sorts of other ways. The coalition government formed by Lloyd George after he succeeded Asquith in 1916 was in many ways both more stable and more effective. This was partly because it was also more narrowly based. The departure of Asquith and most of his Liberal lieutenants meant that Lloyd George was heavily reliant on Conservative support, as I mentioned a moment ago, although he did retain the support of Arthur Henderson and the Labour Party, which I think was a bit of a surprise to Asquith. But this did at least mean that his cabinet colleagues were more or less of the same mind on most major questions of war policy. Not all, and there were some points of friction. Senior Conservatives sometimes got upset about Lloyd George's antagonism towards his senior military commanders. Lloyd George absolutely despised Generals Haig and Robertson, and in his memoirs later accused them of trying to overthrow his government and establish a military dictatorship. So it was pretty poisonous, and I think a lot of Conservatives were a bit uneasy about this. But that was probably an exception. I think above all, the Lloyd George coalition had a clear purpose that bound it together, and this was the vigorous prosecution of the war and the defeat of the Central Powers, something which Lloyd George and the Conservatives agreed was not likely to happen under Asquith. So, as I mentioned already, when this military victory was achieved, following the German military and political collapse in 1918, the coalition government calls a snap general election to renew its mandate for the transition to peacetime. And the composition of this coalition government, the one that fights the election, is not quite the same as that of Lloyd George's wartime coalition. The big difference is that the Labour Party withdraws its support, although Lloyd George does retain the loyalty of a handful of patriotic Labour leaders. Some of them form the National Democratic Party. There's the British Workers' League. So this is kind of collection of slightly rogue Labour patriots that do stick with the coalition, but Henderson pulls the rest of the Labour Party into opposition. The result of that election, as we've already mentioned, was a landslide victory for the coalition. And Lloyd George's position now seems unassailable. He boasted huge popular prestige and I think this is also significant, a degree of institutional power that few, if any, Conservative prime ministers had enjoyed before him. And this was the result of a series of wartime administrative and constitutional innovations, like the creation of a centralised cabinet secretariat under Maurice Hankey, the first cabinet secretary, at the heart of the Whitehall machine, and the creation of what was known as the Garden Suburb, a kind of collection of sheds in the Downing Street garden, which housed a small group of policy advisors drawn from outside the formal civil service, which reported directly to the Prime Minister and gave him far greater reach across government and into different departments than was usually the case. But, as we've said, 4 years after this great triumph, Lloyd George was out of office, never to return, despite many years of trying. So what went wrong? Well, despite the many strengths in Lloyd George's institutional and political position, he was, as I've said, still ultimately dependent on the support of Conservative MPs to retain office. The 1918 election returned 379 Conservatives and just 127 coalition Liberals. And despite the wide acclaim of Lloyd George as the man who won the war, and the genuine, I think, admiration and loyalty of most of his Conservative cabinet colleagues, Conservative support on the backbenches, and in particular in the constituency associations, i.e. the local Conservative activists, was never particularly solid. And we might all be familiar with the scandals that plagued the post-1918 Lloyd George government, above all the sale of honours. There was also considerable resentment at Lloyd George's presidential style of leadership, which now seemed far less appropriate than it had done during the crisis of war. And there was Conservative alarm at what they saw as Lloyd George's reckless foreign policy. The Chanak crisis, which saw Britain lurch dangerously close to war with Turkey, was one of the major catalysts for the Conservative decision to withdraw support at the Carlton Club meeting in October 1922. But rather like with Asquith, I think there were again some more profound structural weaknesses in the Lloyd George government after 1918. As modern Liberal Democrats probably know too well, all coalition governments are subject to centrifugal forces which threaten to break them apart. And I think coalitions that can withstand these forces most effectively tend to do so when they have one, or better still, both of two things. One, a clear and unifying political purpose, and the second, the ability to hold together a coherent electoral base. In the case of Lloyd George and the Conservatives, after December 1916, the central purpose of the coalition was clear, as I said before, the vigorous prosecution of the war. But what would it be once victory had been secured? In the short term, I think the answer to this question was probably twofold. First, secure the peace treaty with the defeated Central Powers, which was what Lloyd George threw his energies into immediately. And second, to oversee the demobilisation of the British Armed Forces and the reintegration of the soldiers into civilian society, which was a really significant challenge. Something like 1 in 4 adults in Britain had served in the armed forces during the war, totally unprecedented for a country which traditionally relied on a small volunteer army. But those were both sort of short to medium term challenges. In the longer term, I think the central purpose of the coalition was probably felt to be the need to confront the threat of socialism and the rising power of the organised working class. So the recent Bolshevik seizure of power in Russia was obviously an important piece of context here, but there was also the electoral advance of the Labour Party in Britain, a party which was now formally, openly committed to socialism. It was there in the party constitution, even if this was never very precisely defined. There was also the growing power of the trade unions, whose membership had doubled during the war. And again, I think this wider context of the war really matters. The war had been sold to the public as a kind of moment of profound national unity, but it was also an experience that really sharpened class tensions. And it did so in a number of ways. One of the ways it did this was to sharpen middle-class resentment against the working class, which it was thought had used trade union power and the threat of strikes to shirk military service while extracting higher wages at a time of national emergency. So for many Conservatives in 1918, I think the central appeal of renewed coalition with Lloyd George was precisely that it seemed to offer the surest way of resisting the threat from Labour, something which it was feared the Conservative Party alone could not hope to do. And indeed, some leading unionist politicians, and I'm thinking most notably Austin Chamberlain, wanted not merely coalition with Lloyd George, but fusion between the Conservative and Liberal parties. And obviously Austin Chamberlain might think this because his father, Joseph Chamberlain, had been a Liberal MP, had split from Gladstone over Gladstone's Irish policy, had formed a breakaway party, the Liberal Unionists, which had ultimately merged with the Conservative Party to create the Edwardian Unionist Party. So such things were possible. And for leaders like Austin Chamberlain, the threat from Labour after 1918 now seemed so serious that the old divisions between Liberal and Unionist, Liberal and Conservative, divisions based on religious denominational politics or the contest between free trade and tariff reform or protection, these needed to be cast aside. There was a more serious threat to confront. As the basis for coalition unity, let alone fusion between Liberals and Conservatives, however, this central purpose quickly ran into two problems. The first was that many Conservatives quickly realised that the threat posed by Labour had been significantly exaggerated. And the Labour Party consistently failed to mobilise a majority of working class support throughout the 1920s and probably throughout the 1930s. Indeed, the success of the independent Conservative candidate who beat both Liberal and Labour opposition to win the Newport by-election in October 1922 seemed to prove to Conservatives that the coalition wasn't needed to hold off the challenge from Labour. They could do it alone. And it might be significant that the result of the Newport election is announced on the morning of the Carlton Club meeting. So again, it's kind of lucky timing for anti-coalition Conservatives. The other problem arguably arose from the political strategy which the Lloyd George coalition adopted. The coalition sought to keep class war at bay by pursuing an ambitious programme of social reconstruction, housing, an expansion of national insurance, but also the deliberate encouraging of a post-war economic boom which facilitated the absorption of ex-soldiers into the labour force at the cost of relatively high levels of inflation. And unfortunately for Lloyd George, the high cost of social reconstruction in taxes, but also the impact of high levels of inflation on those on fixed incomes was fiercely resisted by the suburban, salaried and professional middle class who formed the bedrock of Conservative support in the country. And the result of this was a middle class revolt against the coalition. And you see this manifest in groups like the Anti-Waste League, which are sort of pressure groups set up with the support of the right-wing press to complain about high levels of tax and high levels of spending. And they start running independent candidates in by-elections against the coalition. And this really alarms the Conservative leadership. And I think what the Anti-Waste League and groups like it are protesting against, in a narrow sense, it's, as I say, it's kind of tax and spend. But in a broader sense, I think they're protesting against what they see as a failure of political will by the government in its readiness to capitulate to working class pressure. And this revolt forces the government quite quickly into a U-turn. And this is the famous Geddes Acts, sort of swinging cuts in public expenditure, retrenchment and austerity, and the embracing of a deflationary political economy, which prioritizes the interests of the Conservative middle class at the expense of higher unemployment and an attack on social spending on the workers. And once that reversal had happened after 1920, the logic of any coalition between Lloyd George and the Conservatives was really eliminated. And the coalition kind of clings on for 2 more years. But already by 1920-21, I think a significant and perhaps an irresistible part of the Conservative Party had come to believe that Lloyd George was not simply unnecessary to hold off the advance of Labour, but unacceptable as the leader of a government who had failed to protect the interests of the core suburban middle-class Tory electorate. In other words, and I suppose this is where I'll conclude, Lloyd George fell in part because he was still a liberal in meaningful ways, and he was not someone that could be comfortably assimilated into the version of the Conservative Party which existed in Britain in the 1920s. If the 2 planks on which coalition government can best be sustained are, as I said, the articulation of a coherent vision on matters of national importance and the successful mobilization of a cohesive and broad-based electoral coalition, then the post-war government led by Lloyd George failed because it never resolved the tension between these 2 imperatives. Its strategy for resisting the rise of Labour and for holding off the threat of class war was fundamentally unacceptable to the core electoral constituency of the dominant Tory wing of the coalition. And I think for that reason, the Lloyd George government was, if not doomed from the start, then at the very least faced with a political challenge which was probably almost impossible to solve. And I'll stop there.
Well, that was absolutely fascinating. That was brilliant. Thank you so much. I mean, don't know where to start. Duncan, should we start? Have we got some questions lined up on the chat?
Well, we have one question, which Matt has half answered already in his talk. So perhaps while other people are getting ready with questions, and for the 53 people who are joining us online, please post any questions you've got in the chat. Perhaps I could just say a few words about the Liberal Democrat History Group for those of you who are not so familiar with us. And it is really nice to be able to say this in person rather than online. This is the first in-person meeting we've held since January 2020. But of course, it's hybrid. So we have, as I said, over 50 people there. So we were founded as the History Group in 1988, when this party, the Liberal Democrats, was founded, with the remit of encouraging discussion and research of the histories of the party, the Liberal Democrats, and its predecessor parties, the Liberal Party and the SDP. And we do this in 4 main ways. We published the Journal of Liberal History. So this is the latest issue, just out a few weeks ago. Normally it's a mixture of articles and meeting reports and book reviews and so on. This is a special themed issue, actually, which we do publish once a year normally, on the Liberal Party and the American Civil War of the 1860s. We're working on 2 further special issues, themed issues at the moment, one on Liberals and Empire, and the other one on the record of the Lloyd George coalition. So not just the fall of it, but looking in more detail about what it achieved and what it failed at. So one of those will come out next year. We also publish a range of reference books and booklets. This is one you may be familiar with, a concise history of the party since the 17th century, and British political liberalism. It's really good for new members of the Liberal Democrats if you want to give them an introduction. And we are working on our next publication, should be either a long booklet or a short book on Liberals and by-elections. So we're going to look at the importance of by-elections to the Liberal Party and the SDP and the Liberal Democrats, going right back into the 18th century. It's taking us a while to do that because there are quite a few important by-elections, so that won't be published until next year, but that should be the next one we come out. Third thing we do is organize meetings like this one. So it's a pleasure to be back in person. The next one will be at Liberal Democrat Federal Conference in September, where we're organizing actually not one, but 2 meetings. The first one on the Saturday lunchtime in the Grand Hotel in Brighton is looking at the political career of Shirley Williams, who of course died just last year. And we'll have people who are familiar with her, who worked with her, talking about her impact and her political career. And the second one we're organizing on the Sunday lunchtime, also in the Grand Hotel, where Vince Cable is launching his memoirs of his time as coalition minister and party leader in the period from 2010 through to 2019. He has provocatively called the meeting, "Was the coalition a mistake? And why did we fail to stop Brexit?" So I hope it will be an interesting discussion. And then the next meeting we'll have is probably one in January or February next year, again, back here in the National Liberal Club, but also because the NLC is really well set up for hybrid meetings online at the time. And then the fourth thing we do is organise a website which has many resources for students of political history. And you can also see there, you can look on our website for subscriptions to the journal and buy our publications. And that's at www.liberalhistory.org.uk. So thanks very much. Should we take some questions? Okay, so we have the question that Matt already touched on was about the Newport by-election. So it's from David Yates from Leicester University. Given that the Carlton Club meeting was deliberately scheduled for the day after the Newport by-election, which most Liberals thought that Labour would win, to what extent did the Conservative victory affect the decision made? In short, did the Conservative win at Newport effectively seal the fate of the coalition?
I'm honestly not sure, and maybe a Conservative Party historian would be better able to answer that question. It's absolutely right that the result was quite unexpected, and the Labour Party had a very successful run of by-elections at the expense of the coalition since 1918. The election was an odd one because there was no coalition candidate. So sometimes independent Conservatives ran against official coalition Liberals, and for obvious reasons. When the parties did their deal in the coupon election in 1918, I mean, they divided the map up, and local associations were often very unhappy at the results. If you were a local Conservative Party association member and were told that this was a Liberal coalition seat, and you had to either support the coalition Liberal candidate or sit the election out, you weren't very happy. And some independent Conservatives did run and win against coalition Liberals. The Central Party tried to maintain discipline as much as possible, but Newport was unusual because the Liberal candidate was sort of deliberately vague about where exactly he stood. So he never directly attacked the coalition. He talked about his desire for Liberal reunion, but that was sort of widely interpreted as scepticism about the coalition. And of course, one problem for the Liberals in particular was you might have a local MP who was an Asquithian, but a local association that was loyal to Lloyd George. So it was in their interests to be vague and to try and fudge the difference where they could. So to see Newport as a referendum or as a local referendum on the coalition is a bit complicated because there was no one actually making the case for its maintenance. And it was a sort of three-way split, but there's no doubt that the timing was useful. My sense is the forces that would break the coalition were probably strong enough that it would have happened anyway. They had support from a lot of local opinion, a lot of backbench opinion, and I suppose two key factors at the top were Stanley Baldwin, who was prepared to resign from the coalition cabinet and provide some leadership, but also Bonar Law, who had stepped back from politics for ill health and was sort of persuaded to come back out of retirement at just the right moment that he could appear as a credible alternative leader to Lloyd George if the coalition were to fall apart, and he duly becomes Prime Minister after Lloyd George's resignation. So I think it's useful to the Conservative anti-coalitionists. I do think it matters. I don't think it's decisive.
Interesting question about the fact that coalitions are very rarely on a ballot paper, aren't they? Just saying. Duncan, you got some more?
Yeah, we've got quite a few. So the next one is from James Breckel. How did the coalition Liberals react to the decision made by the backbench Conservatives? So what was their response in the coalition Liberal Party?
They're obviously not thrilled. They do maintain their status as an independent party, though, and I do think that's interesting that they don't immediately run back to the Asquithians and try to reunite the party. They had been called the Coalition Liberals, and they renamed themselves as the National Liberals, and they do fight the general election in 1922 as an independent party. They reunite the following year. 1923 is the year of Liberal reunion, but they do so really for contingent reasons, which is that once Baldwin replaces Bonar Law as Conservative leader, he calls an election, even though he's got a majority, he calls an election and loses his overall majority on the issue of protection, which he's in favour of and thinks is sort of sensible solution to the economic problems that have really started to set in by 1922-23. The problem is protection is probably the one issue that all Liberals can agree they hate. So he forces the Asquithians and the Lloyd George faction back together. The problem for the Liberals is that this really comes too late. And the result of the election is a hung parliament where the Conservatives are the biggest party, but Baldwin says he's lost his mandate, he's been rejected by the electorate, he's not going to try and form a government, and says that either Asquith as Liberal leader or MacDonald as Labour leader should be allowed the chance to form a government. Asquith demurs to MacDonald. And I think that's really the kind of the nail in the coffin for the Liberals in the 1920s, because the result is a 9-month Labour government, and it's not particularly successful, and it's very short-lived, and it falls very quickly. But it establishes the sort of central fact in British political life that the choice is now between a Conservative government and a Labour government. And this is really fatal to the Liberals. And the result is the Liberal vote collapses, and both the Conservative and Labour votes increase. But also there are an increasing number of defections of Liberal MPs going in both directions. That's really hard to come back from, even though Lloyd George does try. Absolutely, yeah. So they're sort of doubled down. So conservative-minded Liberals are horrified that he's let the socialists into power. Progressive Liberals are horrified that he's turfed them out afterwards. Yeah.
Have we got any more questions from in the room? Yes. Mm-hmm.
Only very recently I became aware of something past the chat incident, which I understand it, this was where paradoxically Lloyd George was gung-ho to take on Act 4.
That's what he's saying.
Fell further the Turkish aspiration, going back on Greece, but our international partners were. But paradoxically, the Conservatives were the peace party. And it seems to me that this was one of the central issues of Carlton. So you could comment on that further. Can I just say one other thing? It strikes me that if you go to Lloyd Jenkins' autobiography of Churchill, not autobiography of Churchill, he tells a tale of where Asquith would prosecute government business and then retire to the Athenaeum, take the book off the shelf, see to read it. Asquith seemed to not see that the role of the Prime Minister was to prosecute. And that's the big difference. So Lloyd George did, because it seemed to make Churchill do it. You could say Thatcher. They were in charge, they had the generals around them. And that's the big difference. Asquith's approach to fund, facilitate, supply the war, but not.
So sorry, the questions can't, sorry, the people online can't hear the question. So either the microphone's not on.
Okay,
So
so two questions. One about the Chanak incident. Can you say a bit more about that? Because it seemed that Lloyd George seemed to be more interested in pursuing a foreign policy, an aggressive foreign policy agenda, and the Tories were a bit more pacifist about things. And then secondly, Asquith didn't prosecute the war. He was rather very hands off, which left a space for Churchill to prosecute World War I, and that perhaps played out further down the century, further down the decades with World War II and even the Falklands.
Thank you. Yeah. So there's a lot there, and I think Chanak, yeah, it's interesting, and I think you're right. Conservative Party is very alarmed at Lloyd George's kind of imperial adventurism. And one of the things they're worried about, as you said in the question, is British isolation, that Britain's allies are not on board with this. The French are not sympathetic, but nor is the Empire, or most of the dominions, the white settler colonies. So it's partly about that. I don't think it comes out of nowhere. And there's a kind of an odd prehistory to this, which is that Lloyd George, I mean, it's a weird bookend for his career, because he starts as an anti-imperial opponent. He's seen as a pro-Boer. He's opposed to the British war in South Africa, and is kind of reviled by the Tories for that. And there's a sort of story that he's forced to flee a public meeting in Birmingham, an anti-war meeting disguised as a policeman, because he's going to be at risk of the mob if he doesn't, and ends sort of so gung-ho, so bellicose that the Conservatives are kind of unnerved by it. But one thread that does run through his career is hostility to Turkey. And I think he partly sees himself as the heir to the kind of Gladstonian tradition of standing up for Christian peoples that are threatened by the Ottoman Empire. But the language he uses about the Turkish government, whether that's the old Ottoman Empire or the new regime, is really strong right from the start. And if you look at his wartime speeches, he seems to kind of hate the Turkish regime more than the Germans to start off with. And there's a moment where he refers, because everyone talks about this war against Prussianism, and Prussian or Hun is often used instead of Germans. And there's a moment early in the war where Lloyd George refers to the Prussians as the Turks of the West. And he says, the Turks of the East and the Turks of the West. So that's his kind of prism for thinking about. And what he means by that is he's talking about regimes that he sees as an enemy of Christian values and of civilized values, which is obviously one of the kind of master narratives of the British prosecution of the war against Germany, that what's happening in Belgium is the sign of a kind of barbaric people. On the Conservative side of things, I think something interesting is happening there as well. And there's a really, really excellent book by Alison Light called Forever England, which touches on this, that says that in the sort of the public discourse in Britain, the way people talk about national character and about masculinity and about conservative values shifts as a result of the First World War, partly in reaction to the horror of war and the horror of industrialized warfare. We see it in the war poets, going from kind of romantic glorification of war to profound disillusionment. And I think some of that stuff is perhaps oversold, but what Alison Light argues is that there's a new understanding of what it means to be an Englishman or a British man. And it's a more domestic, less imperial, masculine ideal. And so the kind of the archetypal gentleman is or not gentleman, because it's not really classed in that way, but the archetypal man is someone who stays home and kind of has an allotment and is not an imperial adventurer, as the Victorians would have recognized them, or as the Edwardians. And obviously this is complicated, not everyone subscribes to this, but I think Stanley Baldwin does. And it's precisely the mode of kind of personal behavior that he models as Prime Minister. He positions himself as a kind of ordinary, domestic, gentle, thoughtful individual, not an abstract thinker, not a swashbuckler, not a Churchillian hero. And I think it becomes part of the story of kind of English or British exceptionalism in the interwar period, is that Britain is not like the militarized regimes that are forming fascist Italy, Franco-Spain, Nazi Germany. It doesn't do paramilitarism, it doesn't do jackboots and marching, it does kind of quiet domestic life. And that's a kind of a new understanding of a conservative version of Englishness or Britishness, where the empire is much more in the background than it had been in earlier periods. And I think, perhaps Chanak is a kind of turning point in that transformation.
Yeah, so we've got two connected questions online. So from Frank Curtis, did Ireland make a difference to the stability of the coalition? And Steve Comer, following on from Frank's question, which of course they can see, how important was the establishment of the Irish Free State and Conservative support for hardline unionism, especially in the north of Ireland, in bringing about the end of the coalition?
Yeah, so that's, I mean, a really, really important question, and a huge one in all kinds of ways. It does matter, and Ireland kind of matters throughout the war. I mean, in 1914, it's credibly been argued that Ireland is on the brink of civil war. The Liberals have been trying to push their home rule policy, effectively a form of devolution, which will establish a parliament in Dublin. The Protestants in Ulster are fiercely opposed to this. They form a paramilitary organisation, the Ulster Volunteers. The Irish Nationalists form a paramilitary organisation to defend home rule. It's not clear that the Asquith government has a grip on this. There's the kind of Curragh Mutiny in 1914, where a group of army officers resign their commissions because they're concerned that they're about to be deployed to suppress the Protestants in Ulster. So Ireland is a really, really dangerous problem for any British government. And in the short term, the outbreak of war seems like a godsend, because I think if it's Asquith says, the real Armageddon, or maybe it was a Churchill phrase, but the sort of the problems in Ireland are dwarfed by the emergence of the real Armageddon. But of course, that respite proves short-lived. And in the short term, the Irish nationalist leader, John Redmond, is very supportive of the British war effort, but there is a more hardline nationalist Republican minority that launches the Easter Rising. That definitely helps discredit the Asquith regime. Part of your question was about their styles of leadership, and there's a story that when Asquith is told about, there's been a rising in Ireland, he sort of says, "Oh, that's interesting," and kind of goes to bed to sort of deal with it in the morning. The question is sort of what you do with it afterwards. And Lloyd George's policy towards Ireland during the war is slightly incoherent. Ireland is exempt from conscription when it was introduced for the rest of the United Kingdom, for the reason that it's widely anticipated that if you try to conscript the Irish, you're likely to provoke an uprising. So you're going to have to garrison an army there, and it's kind of, can you extract more soldiers than you need to then impose on Ireland to keep them quiet? Lloyd George tries to resurrect the policy of home rule as Prime Minister before the end of the war, but doesn't succeed, partly because the old constitutional nationalists are already in retreat, and what becomes Sinn Féin is on the march and is not interested in joining this, partly because the Ulster Protestants are not willing to negotiate on anything that leaves Ulster under a Dublin Parliament, and partly because Lloyd George's kind of grand scheme is to say home rule plus conscription, which alienates everyone and is sort of doomed to fail right from the start. So the result is, in the general election of 1918, the Irish Parliamentary Party is more or less wiped out. Sinn Féin take nearly all the seats, withdraw, refuse to take their seats in Westminster, and set up an independent parliament. You then get the Anglo-Irish War. And this is sort of politically unsustainable for Lloyd George, I think partly because the narrative that they've told about the Great War is that this is a war that Britain is fighting with allies for democracy, for civilized values, against Prussian barbarism. But of course, the Anglo-Irish War is a dirty war, and there are atrocities on all sides. And the charge is levelled against the British government that the Black and Tans are behaving in Ireland exactly as the German army did in Belgium. And if that's the case, it's an insult to the memory of the fallen, and it's a betrayal of their sacrifice, quite apart from the logistical and financial and diplomatic problems. So the result is the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and it's probably necessary, and I think a lot of the unionist leadership come to recognise that. But again, for Conservative backbench opinion and for Conservative association opinion, this is a betrayal. And Ross McKibben, another excellent historian, wrote a book about 10 years ago on sort of British political history over the first 50 years of the 20th century. And one of his points there was that local Conservative associations are still run by Edwardian Tories and unionists, and they are unionists, and they really resent the betrayal of the union as they see it. So yeah, I think that is also a problem for Lloyd George.
Take a couple from the room.
So if you can speak up really clearly, we'll see if this microphone.
So two separate questions, if I may. The first one for you, since my but to what extent, if any, the Asquithian and Lloyd second element is, strikes me that Lloyd George has been out Margaret Thatcher, a classic example of that.
Oh, okay. Two questions. Firstly, to what extent did the Asquithian and Gladstonian Liberals fight each other in the 22 election? And to what extent was the fact that Lloyd George had been in power for a long period of time, 16 years, really make the difference, as it often has done subsequently with leaders who've gone on too long?
Thanks. So I could give you kind of numbers about 1922. My sense, I mean, this is mainly thinking about anecdotes of people I've been looking at, is that there's less of it in 1922 than there had been in 1918. And even in 1918, there's a kind of sorting process, because there's an expansion of the electorate. Obviously, you've got the Representation of the People Act, which trebles the size of the electorate. You go from 7 million to whatever it is, 22 million voters. The constituency boundaries are all redrawn. So there's a kind of shuffling process for the Liberals, where, as I said before, you get areas where the local association is Asquithian and the MP is a Lloyd George man. And sometimes what they do is, the MP kind of has to leave and find another seat elsewhere. And it happens to William Wedgwood Benn, who is an Asquithian Liberal and is basically kind of told, your constituency is Lloyd George, and we've done the deal with the Unionists, so you have to go somewhere else. And he's a decorated war hero. I mean, he's a really notable pilot in the Royal Flying Corps, and the Asquithians use this to attack the coalition, where they say this is how they treat our war heroes when they come back. There's a kind of squalid deals being done behind the scenes by corrupt party managers, and kind of real patriots have to head up to Scotland or wherever to find a seat that's contestable by an Asquithian. And I think that process has sort of sorted the Liberals to a certain extent. In by-elections, obviously, there's perhaps more of an impulse to kind of run a candidate just to show that you can. But as Newport shows, there are also Liberals that sort of desperately don't want to split their local vote in half by picking a side. So I think it's not unknown, but there's sort of relatively less of it. On the point about being in office for a long time, yeah, absolutely. I do think that's right. And I can't remember who coined the phrase that it's the prime ministerial disease, but they all think of themselves as indispensable until they realise they're not. And that was true of Asquith. He couldn't conceive that a government was, could be formed without him. And I think for quite good reason, because although people attacked his leadership as kind of lacking in dynamism and lacking in drive, he had steered the country through 2 very, very dangerous years. Every belligerent power had problems with shell production. Every belligerent power had problems with mobilization. This wasn't unique to Britain, and I don't think it can be pinned on kind of liberal squeamishness to prosecute the war effectively. He reorganized the military high command. He got rid of French and installed Haig. He did create the Ministry of Munitions, and he got really controversial measures like conscription on the statute book without provoking a strike from the unions, without provoking mutiny by Liberal MPs. And I think that was a deft balancing act. Conservatives wanted him to do it much faster. His argument was always, if we go too fast, we split the unity of the country. Lloyd George had been in office a long time, and say not just as Prime Minister, but in really, really vital offices of state. Lots of his cabinet obviously thought it was time for a break. But I think the other thing about Lloyd George is that, like a lot of his critics, he thought he would probably be back. And the fact that we know that was the last time a Liberal held office as Prime Minister in the 20th century was not something that was taken for granted at the time. And I know Philip Williamson addressed this in his talk to this group before, but there is a kind of conscious decision by the Labour leadership and the Conservative leadership to try and squeeze the Liberals out, partly to prevent Lloyd George coming back to power. But he thinks he can do it. We can conquer unemployment, and in the 1930s he wants to be the British FDR. He talks about a New Deal, and they've got the policy ideas, they've got the kind of the energy and the imagination. So it's not totally inconceivable that he has a role to play.
Thank you. Gentleman over there, and then we'll take the gentleman back.
So, cultural what extent is George's approach prior to law? Prior to the start of the First World War, that in government.
Okay, can we take that? Can we take I'll recap that. And the lady there, please, could you? Yeah.
I would just like to say how fascinating it's been, because my great uncle was Minister of Food Control in and he won the 1920 Northampton budget. There were two in Northampton, and then he was an MP. One in Northampton, and then he won the Northampton budget. He stood at both the national level and then he became chief whip.
Right.
So this has been fascinating.
Thank you.
This is a whole section of history.
Thank you.
So, thank you. Did people get that? People got that? Okay. Yep. Over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, to say that the national picture for Liberals in the 20s is really dire, but in particular constituencies, yeah, it's incredible. I mean, it's real local tenacity and yeah, bucks national trends, and it paid off. There you go.
So Lloyd George's pre-war stance, how did that play into what happened?
Yeah, so I don't think, as I said, you know, he starts off as an anti-imperial radical. He's clearly moved before 1914, and I think there's a few clues to that. He does give a speech in 1911 during the Anglo-German naval race, where he kind of insists that Britain has legitimate aspirations and won't be kind of bullied. And when the German government is trying to test the Entente with France in North Africa, Lloyd George actually turns out to be quite hawkish and says, you know, we will stand by France and we will make sure our interests in North Africa are protected. I think the really revealing episode is in 1910, when the king dies. And of course, 1910 is a year of crisis in British politics because the Lords have rejected the budget, and you have two elections, and the Liberals are about to try and force through the Parliament Act. So it's really, really toxic. And after the king dies, there's an attempt to kind of lower the temperature, and there are some kind of high-level talks between the parties that Asquith authorises, and Lloyd George is one of the Liberal delegates. And when he's there, he seems to sort of go rogue and starts proposing not just a kind of lowering of temperature, but a coalition in which he imagines Asquith might be sent up to the House of Lords. And the result will be a kind of grand bargain where Liberals and Unionists will push through all of their really contentious issues at the same time, which might include things like home rule, might include Unionist priorities like protection or imperial preference, tariff reform, and might include a form of compulsory service. This was something I came across during my doctorate. I mean, obviously it goes nowhere and it's sort of a total non-starter, but I think it's really odd to find 4 years before the war, Lloyd George is willing to think about something like compulsory militia training. I mean, I think what they're probably talking about is limited compulsory training in the new territorial force, which has just been created a couple of years earlier. But you know, and something like, you know, £100 million for the Navy, sort of big naval program as well. So you know, his willingness to kind of buck orthodoxy and to operate outside normal liberal channels is evident there behind the scenes, even by 1910.
Thank you. We've got one gentleman at the back, and then we'll finish with a couple of online questions. So gentleman at the back, please.
Just to add a quick point.
Absolutely. I mean, the 16th and the 36th divisions end up going into the line together, and there's a really poignant moment where Willie Redmond, John Redmond's brother, is killed and ends up dying in the 36th Field Hospital. So this is kind of, and I think this is what John Redmond kind of hoped, that Catholics and Protestants fighting together, you know, Unionists and Nationalists fighting together, might be able to create a more unified Irish identity within some kind of broader British world umbrella. But yeah, not quite. But yeah.
Thank you. Duncan,
Thank
over
you.
to you for some.
So 2 more questions, should we take them? Graham Peters, David Lloyd George launched the 1918 election campaign on the slogan "Homes Fit for Heroes" and appointed the Liberal Christopher Addison to follow through on the issue. How much was Lloyd George's failure to defend Addison from Tory attacks? How much did it contribute to the end of the coalition or demoralisation of the Liberal part of it? And then a good question to end on, Jock Coates. It wouldn't be any kind of Liberal meeting if I didn't ask something about land taxes. So I was wondering whether the abandonment of the land registry, land valuation proposals was something that might have driven Lloyd George towards antagonism with the Tories, or did he regard the house building programme simply as an acceptable substitute?
Thank you for both of those. Yeah, absolutely. I think when Addison is forced out, it is part of that Conservative reaction against Lloyd George's ambitious reconstruction programme, and there's no doubt it's very demoralising for Liberals. Addison is one of the really talented ministers in the cabinet, and it was thought at the time that Asquith had taken most of the really significant Liberals with him, and that Lloyd George had the kind of second and third tier. But Addison was someone who stood out as an extremely effective minister. So I do think that was a problem in its own terms. It definitely contributed to a kind of crisis of confidence and morale among the Liberals. And as I say, I think it fits into that broader breaking down of a kind of shared vision between Liberals and Conservatives under Lloyd George. On land tax, yeah, absolutely, and it should be mentioned. And I think, and not just tax, but the land campaign that Lloyd George was trying to get up and going before 1914. And part of the appeal of that campaign was that it was about tax, but it was also about housing. It was also about wages, and it was the kind of it was proof that the Liberals were not running out of steam, running out of ideas before the war broke out. One of the problems for it is that the war changes the land question. It changes patterns of land holding, it changes patterns of land use. It leads to lots of sales of land. Landed estates become kind of untenable. Another reason why landed Tories kind of hate Lloyd George going forwards. And it kind of takes the steam out of the land campaign as it had been conceived before the war. So yeah, I think something like the Housing Act could have been a substitute for it. And Lloyd George obviously wanted it to be, and there were houses built before the retrenchment set in. But land reform just seems to be one of those questions that's kind of always there, and Lloyd George sort of brings it up to date, and I think imbues it with new promise. But I think it's sort of killed off by the war, as so many other Liberal causes are.
Can I just bring in one comment from online? From Christopher Graham, who says, if we're talking great uncles, mine was Major General Sir Frederick Barton Morris, Director of Military Operations, until he denounced the Prime Minister, Lloyd George, for lying to Parliament about troop strengths on the Western Front.
Right, this is getting altogether far too competitive on the relative front. Matthew, do you want to draw a final observation? Not too strong a parallel with today, but do you want to just draw from those questions?
No, I mean, I think the parallels are very striking, but I think it's the Liberals are a sort of tragic force in the 20s, and they are full of ideas, and I think one of their problems is that they are forced to kind of operate on terrain that they would never otherwise have chosen. And before the war, they can help set the agenda, because the defining controversies of pre-war politics are questions on which Liberals have clear ideas, popular ideas, and ideas which unite them. So when the Conservatives or Unionists try to pick up economic protectionism, Liberals can rally around free trade, and they can do so in a way that ties them to the Labour Party, because Labour and the unions also support free trade, despite the Unionists' best efforts to kind of peel them off. After the war, if the defining question in politics is socialism and anti-socialism, then the Liberal attempt to carve out a kind of third space is difficult. It's difficult in its own terms. It's difficult because the other parties are kind of conspiring to deny them that space. And it's difficult because it's a question on which Liberals don't actually share an answer. And I said, I'm working on this project at the moment about ex-servicemen who go into Parliament in the 1920s, well, across the 20th century, but I'm just finishing up an article on Liberal ex-servicemen in the 20s. And one of the really striking things is they all talk about the war all the time. And, you know, when they publish their election material, there's always a photo of themselves in uniform, not just in 1918, but throughout the 1920s. You know, they talk about their rank, they talk about medals they've won, but the meaning that they attach to their experience of war is sort of totally incoherent. And there are kind of progressive liberals, left-wing liberals, like Josiah Wedgwood, you know, big supporter of land taxation, who says this was a people's war. And he does use that phrase in 1918. And, you know, and we need a people's peace, we need ambitious reconstruction. And, you know, the logic of my national service, or sorry, of my military service is that, you know, it showed when we pull together, we can achieve great things. And there are conservative-leaning liberals, right-wing liberals, who say the war was a struggle against tyranny, oppression, and a kind of bureaucratic Prussian state. And now we see that in socialism at home. So, you know, I'm fighting against, you know, the socialists, who are the new enemy in the mold of the old Prussians. And I think if the liberals are divided on those really, really core questions, then it's extremely difficult for them to kind of carve out a space for themselves, even if the other parties would let them.
And as we watch what we hope to be the dying days of the Tory administration, I think that's a very salutary lesson for those who want to try and talk up the possibilities of coalitions over the next few years. Thank you, Matthew, so much for your talk. Thank you to everybody who came up with such really good and searching questions. Thank you also to the History Group for, as ever, organising a meeting. Even when I don't know what the meeting's going to be about, they always turn out to be really, really fascinating in the detail. Look forward to seeing you in Brighton, as particularly for the Shirley and Vince meetings. But thank you very much, and thanks to those of you who joined us online. Thank you. Good night.